Selamat pagi. UNESCO directors, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to be here. My gratitude to UNESCO and those who made this possible. My name is Oscar Canton. I'm a lawyer, publisher, editor in Ciudad Juárez. I founded Norte newspaper 27 years ago. And as Norte newspaper CEO, I have experienced all kinds of emotions, but nothing like what brought me here, the tragic murder of Miroslava Bridge. Ciudad Juárez is located in the northern region of Mexico, in the state of Chihuahua, the largest in the country. Demographically, the Rio Bravo borders with the United States. Ciudad Juárez, besides being bordered with El Paso, Texas, is the most important border in Mexico. The biggest economy at the border is the manufacturing industry, which generates about 300,000 direct jobs and twice as many indirectly. It is the economic activity of our city with a population of 1,300,000 people. Norte inception. The inception of Norte newspaper began 27 years ago, but this journey started 40 years ago, when I co-founded the newspaper El Universal in my hometown, which was part of the most senior newspaper in Mexico City. There were several factors that led to its creation. At the beginning of my first year at law school, my father and I experienced a tragedy at the hands of corruption, political power, and abuse. My father, a hard-working and honest man who gave his estate on a basis of work and effort, was extorted by the governor, who used the entire judicial apparatus to strip him of property near the border that with time acquired surplus value. Since then, I have understood how far public power can reach to achieve its objectives. I experienced in my own flesh how our freedom was violated when arrested without order or reason. We were coerced and extorted, stripped of property, and threatened to kill me if he did not comply. Such traumatic experiences, so unjust, a violation of human rights, and witnessing how the power that must protect its citizens through the impartation of justice can become a factual power capable of killing. I realized the necessity to seek better living conditions, not only for my first unborn daughter, but to seek justice and equity for the community. I was 28 years old when this journey started. Norte newspaper grew out of the need for a voice that told the truth, as a tool that counterbalanced the abuses, able to defend public opinion. Norte newspaper was born with the premise of truth, fairness, critical journalism, and counterweight, capable of exposing abuses and excess of power. Since 1990, our publication has sought to open awareness and give voice to those who do not have it, promoting transparency and accountability, rule of law. Norte went through extreme situations where it had to face political power and fight to bring information to its readers. Some examples: our building has been shot at, our journalists have been threatened and some were kidnapped, constantly harassed and audited by governments, intimidating our advertisers, tried to put us in jail for denouncing corruption, abuse of power, injustice. But what is my motivation? Love. Love is my motivation. Love for freedom, justice, rule of law, and peace and a better quality of life. In journalism, love goes beyond fear. The premise of information, which must be true and accurate and fair. The most important contribution of Norte has been to inform community in depth, to seek the open, to seek to open the conscience of people so that they have the possibility to discern and choose to reinforce the democratic system that Mexico boasts. Norte has become a counterweight, evidencing the corruption in different situations, not only public power but also private. It has fought and joined the cause for human rights of people accused of crimes they did not commit. The breaking point. Miroslava murder. Miroslava, an example of exercising journalism, what she loved, exposed how organized crime has infiltrated the political party system. To mention some of the coverage that she did. Miroslava Breach was a professional woman in journalism, a mother, a daughter, a sister, a woman with very close family ties, a woman with a lot of vision, analytical, and who always sought to expose the truth and courageous. Our work relationship generated closeness with her. She was a woman with spark, witty, spontaneous, and kind. One night we talked on the phone. Next morning I learned she had been killed. Shot 8 times as she took her son and daughter to school in front of her house. Her family was and is still broken up. She did not deserve that. Her 2 children have now been orphaned. The circumstance of her departure caused me a strong emotional impact. I felt a regret and a grief. I still feel it. Her cowardly murder made me aware of the risks we take with those who exercise or publish stories of high impact. Why shutting down? I was ashamed of myself because it made me reflect on the terrible mistakes that media owners have made, that we did not initially demand justice for the deaths of journalists who have been killed for many years in the past. It is our core responsibility to care and watch over their safety. I felt I had gone wrong. As an interminably synergy, the great corruption, league of politics linked to drug trafficking, and great impunity continue as it did when I started this journey. The result of doing the same thing that has been done has not generated the results we seek. Enough is enough. The closure of Norte is an act of protest to the government for not guaranteeing our safety, our security, and the respect that journalism and media deserve. It is a cry to society so that it is also conscious and demands better journalism. I decided to lower the curtain because if we cannot be loyal to our integrity, giving the reader what we consider must be of his or her knowledge, I could not put at risk my collaborators, their families, or my own. It is a statement of love, of freedom, to pressure for the necessary conditions to exercise a right without impunity. Current state of journalism in Mexico. Journalism in Mexico is worse than ever. The absence of rule of law and ungovernability keeps journalism in a constantly dangerous scenario. The association, Reporters Without Borders, places Mexico as one of the countries with the greatest risk for journalists in Latin America. In addition, in the last 15 years, the danger and risk for journalists in the country has doubled. According to the Special Prosecutor's Office of Crimes Against Freedom of Expression, 97.1% of cases of assault and murder of journalists have not been resolved. In 51 months of the current government of Presidente Enrique Peña Nieto, more than 92,000 deaths related to organized crime have been reported in the country. As you can see, Mexico is under a climate of impunity. Worst thing is that nothing is being done. Neither resolves nor protect journalists. 43 students disappeared at the same time, altogether. Nothing happened. Another fact is that our government has been incapable to repress or contain a factic power of the drug trafficking organization. Mexico apparently is not at war, but reality shows that in certain regions of our country it is a failed state. Organized crime controls. Corruption is out of control as impunity. Mexico, as an example, has 32 states or provinces, of which 16 former governors or governors today are being prosecuted, are in jail, or fugitives. Most of them belong to the president's political party. The closure is an invitation to the population to join efforts and reconsider the importance and legacy of professional journalism, which promotes and guarantees a democratic system of government. The free press is undoubtedly the pillar of the development of any country, regardless of the continent, since freedom of expression is a value and a right of citizens. There is a need and pending issue for media, civil organizations, journalists, and governments to develop new strategies to ensure the exercise of journalism and information around the world. A free press will always bring a healthier and more democratic government. We need to think of our future generations, the challenge. According to PISA, an international metric, Mexico's average education level is of an 8th grader, equivalent to second year of middle school. 43% of the population is less than 15 years old and doesn't have a basic education complete, nor the skills to deal with global challenges. How can we expect a population with such level of education to stand up for democracy, rule of law, and accountability? We need to promote international public policies to promote ethical, moral, and rules of law in basic education levels. We need to create international observatories to eradicate impunity on crimes committed against journalists. We need mechanisms to fund investigative journalism, critical journalism, to be free of manipulation and control by governments. Independent local news organizations are the most vulnerable. In Mexico, investigative, critical, and counterweight journalism is in danger of extinction. Crime and government are its main threat. Journalists increasingly have little or no tools to deal with this reality. We want justice for Miroslava and all journalists that have lost their lives. Today, our call to world nations is not to leave us alone, but to help us to preserve peace, freedom, democracy, and life. Thank you. Terima kasih. May peace be with you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Oscar Cantu. Kamera tolong disorot. Mohon disorot kamera. Juru kamera boleh diambil gambarnya dan ditayangkan. Tolong juru kamera ditayangkan di layar supaya yang lainnya bisa melihat. Please give another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
We now go into the plenary session entitled Spotlight on Investigative Journalism, Perspectives from Southeast Asia and Beyond. May I kindly invite to be seated in front, Sheila Aleshi, Coordinator, Asia Media Partners International Consortium for Investigative Journalists, Maria Reza, CEO of Rappler, Anas Aremeau Anas, Award winner Undercover Investigative Journalist, Rana Sabak, Executive Director of the Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, Wahyu Jatmika, Executive Editor of Tempo Indonesia. Our moderator for this session is Mr. Giles Trendle. Mr. Giles Trendle is Acting Manager Director and Director of Programs of Al Jazeera English. He is the Acting Managing Director and Programs of Al Jazeera English, where he oversees an editorial staff of over 400 people based in its centers of Doha, London, Washington, D.C., and Kuala Lumpur, as well as in over 70 bureaus around the world. Giles first joined Al Jazeera in 2004 to work on the Arabic channel's flagship investigative documentary show before moving to Al Jazeera English ahead of its launch in 2006. He began his career in the mid-1980s as a freelance print journalist based in Lebanon, covering the country's civil war. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Giles Trendle.
Good morning and assalamu alaikum. Before we start the panel, we're actually going to bring up somebody to announce her new book, because UNESCO have just launched a new book and it's very relevant to this particular panel that we're going to discuss. So I'm going to invite very quickly Julie Passetti on stage to talk about the book that's been launched today from UNESCO. It's called Protecting Journalism, Sources in the Digital Age. Julie.
Thank you. Selamat pagi. That was a very powerful session. I'm here launching for UNESCO a book called Protecting Journalism Sources in the Digital Age. As you've heard, it's a major study that examines the conditions of the source protection in 121 countries around the world. When we mapped these challenges that are confronting legal protections for journalism based on confidential sources, what we found was rather chilling. There were global trends. We found that source protection laws are being overridden by national security and anti-terrorism legislation overreach. They're being undercut by surveillance and jeopardised by mandatory data retention policies. They're also outdated when it comes to questions of whether digitally stored material, for example, that's used by journalists to gather stories and interact with sources, is covered by existing laws. In one of the case studies that's featured in the book, we found that the impact of these challenges on investigative journalism practice globally is significant. There's a case of journalists going back to what they refer to as analogue basics, for example, and recognition that they need to be trained in the use of encryption and other defensive measures. There's also some suggestion that they need to train their sources, for example. One of the major recommendations is an 11-point plan, which is a model framework for source protection. We've got copies of that here, along with copies of the book, and all the material is available online. Just to highlight 2 points from that 11-point framework that you can use to measure the state of your own country's source protection framework. We say that source protection should extend to all acts of journalism across all platforms, and that journalism should be shielded from targeted surveillance and data retention. And we say that because without substantial strengthening of legal protections and limitations like this, investigative journalism that relies on confidential sources will be really difficult to sustain in this digital era. And the cost of that could be that much important public interest information, including stories about corruption and abuse, could remain hidden from public view. That's not good for any of us. So I just encourage you to read the study and to examine the recommendations within, but to do so with a view to take action, because this issue is quite urgent. Thanks very much.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah. Thank you, Julie. Okay, let me introduce the panel, and then we'll get started. So, on my left, Sheila Alechi is Coordinator of Asia Media Partners for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. She's based in Washington, D.C. She spent many years in Japan. She's published a book in Japanese on the Panama Papers. So she's going to give us a good global perspective on investigative journalism. Wahyu Diatmika is much more local. He's the executive editor of Tempo magazine in Indonesia. And he's also worked on the Panama Papers project, which of course exposed offshore financial connections with major political and business figures in the world. To his left, Rana Sabah is based in Jordan. Rana is the executive director of the Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, ARIJ, and her organization supports spreading the culture of accountability journalism in newsrooms throughout many countries in the Middle East. To her left is Anas Aramiyao Anas. Now, Anas has a very interesting story. Of course, he's wearing a mask, and there's a very good reason for that, which we will go into. Anas is a very famous, actually, undercover reporter. He's from Ghana in Africa, and he's actually worked on many projects with Al Jazeera English. So although he's worked with us, I've never seen his face either. So he keeps his identity very well concealed, and there are very good reasons for that, which I'm sure we'll get into. And so on the far side is Maria Oresa, the Chief Executive Officer and Executive Editor of Rappler, which is a social news network based in the Philippines. So let's get straight into the questions and the debate. What I want to do broadly is ask all the panelists firstly about the current status of investigative journalism. They can talk about their specific region or more generally around the world. Then we're going to look at the challenges of investigative journalism. Then we're going to look at the opportunities that exist today. And we'll then open up to the floor for some audience questions to get it to be interactive. So I'm actually going to start with Wahyu, because we want to start locally. And I'd like to get your idea of what are the main themes of investigative journalism from your perspective, and what is the status of investigative journalism in your world, as it were, today?
Thank you, Gerald. Good morning, everyone. It's really an honor to be here representing Indonesian media workers and journalists in general. Addressing the question of investigative journalism in Indonesia, I think we have seen a tremendous changes in the last 1 or 2 years, thanks to the increasing interest to investigative journalism among younger journalists. I think Panama Papers obviously helps. After we published the Panama Papers, Tempo received a lot of questions, a lot of offer to cooperate and collaborate. And a lot of projects are ongoing now. Tempo and several other media are now in the process of setting up a common platform for investigative journalism. Hopefully it will be launched in the middle of this year. So that's a very promising and positive development. Although I have to say, if we still relies on the current business model of media organization, there's still a long way to go to have more investigative stories in the media. Because if we still relies on advertising and we still relies on traffics per se, then that's not really a landscape where you can see investigative journalism flourish. So you have to find new business models, and I think in the last couple of years, Indonesia have seen new startups, media startups that are looking for new ways to fund journalism.
So it's new startups and new opportunities. Are you relatively positive and optimistic about the future of investigative journalism?
Well, it really depends on what happens now in the next couple of years. The new startups also, obviously have to prove themselves that the new business model that they are offering can work, and the quality of stories that they are producing is up to the standard. But it's promising.
Okay, good. That's a relatively optimistic view. To stay mainly in the region, I'm going to go to the far side now to Maria. Maria from Rappler. Countries in Asia Pacific, there's the World Press Freedom Index. According to the World Press Freedom Index, many countries in the Asia Pacific have not done very well. They have either stagnated or they've worsened significantly in terms of their media freedom. But specifically in the Philippines, what are the main themes that you're dealing with, and what is the status of investigative journalism? We'll get in more detail into the themes, but as an overview, give us an overview.
Sure. First, wow, I can hear myself, but just the monitors I don't think are on, so we only hear echoes of each other. It would be great if we can turn them on stage. I think from what I heard that you said, Giles, the context of the Philippines are three main points, right? Kind of like many other countries in the world, we have a very popular, more authoritarian leader who has been elected, largely on the back of very justified anger that democracy has not trickled down, that it hasn't brought its promise to the majority of Filipinos. Based on that, he campaigned and ran on a promise to eradicate drugs, a drug war. That drug war has brought in roughly, by last count, it was from July 1 to January 31, roughly up to 7,000 people killed in that. The police say a little less than 3,000 are in legitimate police operations, and then very different breakdowns of what it is. Add to that a very strong propaganda machine. And we've done a series on this, an investigative report that showed, it's hard to understand me, right? We have to turn the monitors on. But the propaganda machine, and I think this goes to what Richard Gingras said yesterday from Google, it's hyper-partisan websites, some of them moving into fake news, others just taking a shred of truth and then pushing it for an agenda. And so what's happened is that journalists are not only having to do the investigative reports to hold officials accountable, but also are going to have to convince their audiences more today that what they're reporting is true. So those are the three main threats, I think, that the challenges that we're facing. Just so you know how weaponized it's become, nearly every reporter that is reporting actively on either the drug war, the president, on social media, has his or her own dedicated troll. Women journalists have it worse in terms of sexist and misogynistic accounts. So there's the physical danger, and then I think the new thing now is that the danger is more psychological. How far will you go? What is true, what is not true, even for the journalists, in terms of threats.
Okay, and I want to come back to you later to talk more about some of your personal experiences of intimidation. To Maria's point about the sound, maybe for the audience it's fine, it's a little bit unclear for the panelists here. If the technicians could turn down the two sound monitors at the front of the stage here, just so we could hear a bit more clearly. Are we all feeling that it's a little bit unclear, the sound here? Yeah.
Monitor yang di depan boleh dikecilkan.
Okay. Thank you. Let me come to Anas now. Anas, thank you for attending. Can you give us, from your view, what are your main themes in terms of investigative journalism? Are you optimistic for the future in investigative journalism? Or do you think, as was said earlier, it's in danger of extinction?
Well, I think that in spite of everything, we should be very optimistic. I mean, investigative journalism, especially in Africa, is we should first get the background, we are virtually mushrooming democracies. We are also third world countries. And as we keep pushing the frontiers, we ought to be aware that if your democracy is about 50 years and you compare it to the Western democracies, that is about 200 years, you realize that there definitely will be problems. I normally do not want to focus on the problems. Yes, they will always be there. But we don't need anybody on the African continent to come and do our journalism for us. It is for us to push the frontiers. And if we are learning, we should know that people toiled in the Western countries. Journalists like Nellie Blair in America, journalists in Britain had toiled to get their countries where they've been to. Of course, we cannot say all this without talking about stereotyping, the kind of perception people give African journalists or African issues. Clearly, the days of parachute journalism should be over now. I mean, because we are capable of telling our own stories. It's usually very common to see people flying, spend 2-3 days, and they say they are telling our stories. I don't think that's the way forward. We have the capacity, we are able to tell our stories in the best ways. Whereas we live in the community and know the myths that surround the societies, we always call to get the appropriate platforms to tell the story. So we would always say that the Western media should perhaps reorient themselves with the thought that you always have to send your people in there to come and tell those stories. I mean, we know the issues, we live with those issues, we know the myths that surround us, and we have the capacity to tell those stories and to tell them well. So yes, investigative journalism, in my opinion, we have a bright future. The problems will be there, but we must have the tenacity, the power, despite the difficulties, to face them and to push the frontiers of our democracy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Anas. Rana, let's come to you. You're based in Jordan, in the Middle East. Obviously, a lot of conflict in the Middle East, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We've got Syria, Iraq, Yemen, tensions, many tensions in other countries such as Lebanon, authoritarian regimes. What is the experience for you of investigative journalism in such a region? Are there bright lights ahead, a bright future, or is it something that's quite a dark future?
Thank you. As you said, I live and work in one of the most dangerous regions in the world, and our reporters, as you said, I come from one of the most dangerous regions in the world, and the reporters working in our network in 21 Arab countries are working in extremely hostile and dangerous situations, but it is our job, to push the limits and to do good journalism that is in favor of the public and accountability. The latest Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index 2017 gave the Arab world one of the worst ratings, and under the Arab world we have 2 or 3 countries that are extremely dangerous. Egypt is one of the largest jails worldwide, and in Egypt is where the bulk of our journalists come from and are operating. A few months ago, Arish, in cooperation with the BBC Arabic, did an investigation on the death of soldiers in the Central Security Forces. As a result of this investigation, we have been accused of being agents of the CIA that are seeking to undermine Egypt. BBC has been accused of plotting to undermine Egypt, and the journalist working with us has been sacked from his job, and of course he faced a witch hunt, and he was cursed on most of the pro-regime media. In Tunisia, for example, it's one of the countries where press freedoms have done much better since the Arab Spring, but unfortunately, in the latest index, it has slipped back 1 point. And even in Tunisia, our journalist did an investigation with Al Jazeera English on torture continuing in police stations. And because the Tunisians do not love Al Jazeera for what they think is, biases in covering the revolution, the investigation was discounted on that ground. However, a year later, the journalist won an award, and everybody's attention turned to that journalist. And today, the Tunisians, as a result, have set up a commission that's looking into terror allegations. Jordan, where I live, is not any better. Of course, we don't have journalists disappearing, but we have also slipped on the index. And this year has been a very difficult year because of all the government orders, the gag orders on the local media. So a local NGO has issued its 2017 report called Banned from Publication. The last thing is that our journalists are not just facing pressure from their governments, but also from gunmen in Iraq, from ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, from militias in Yemen like the Houthis. So it's really very difficult. But having said that, the organization I have been running for the last 11 years is now working across the Arab world. We have at least 8 local chapters that have come out of this foundation, and they have been mostly trained by us. They continue to push the limits. We are partnering with international organizations like ICIJ and OCCRP. We have been part of the Panama Papers. We have done 10 investigations under that big group. And we're there to stay and to continue.
Okay. And let's finally come to Sheila. So you have a great deal of experience in investigative journalism, and you're based in the US, but you've obviously worked around the world, particularly in Japan. I think, is it right, the Consortium of Investigative Journalists has more than 190 investigative journalists in more than 65 countries. So you have a real global look and a global experience. Give us your idea and what are the themes of investigative journalism from your perspective, and what's the future?
Okay. So I want to follow up on Wahyu's positive note. I think now, like in the past few months and also before, there have been a lot of attacks to the media and a lot of discussions about fake news and things like that. But on the other hand, it could be, I see it as a catalyst for investigative journalism. I see that the field is vibrant. So I'm based now in the US, where some news organizations have been hiring investigative journalists in the past few months. I started as a journalist here in Asia, and since I left Asia in 2014, I saw a lot of an increasing number of investigative centers. For example, I don't know, like the Korean Center for Investigative Journalism is very active, and I think this month or next month in Japan, there will be the first investigative reporting conference. And so, I think obviously each country is different. We cannot say, it's very difficult to generalize, but I see that on one hand, there are more challenges in countries like I'm from Italy, and even in Italy, we have been seeing an increasing number of lawsuits against journalists. So it's not easy, and it's not an easy job. It's never been, I guess. But younger generations and also older generations have been reacting very positively, creating new centers, creating new ways of investigating stories and like involving the audience and the readers and people in different ways. So.
Okay. Maria, you're still having problems hearing a bit at your end. Yes. I don't know if the technicians can help sort this out. It's just a little bit difficult for us at the panel here to hear. There's a lot of feedback from the speakers. Anyway, let's move on to the challenges of investigative journalism. We've had an overview from everybody. I want to delve now into the more details of the challenges of investigative journalism. And I want to start with Maria. So obviously you've had a new president in the last year, Rodrigo Duterte, who's launched a very controversial war on drugs. And he's been called an international role model for Mr. Trump for all sorts of reasons. You have done a lot of reporting on his war on drugs and why that is so controversial. And a lot of the problems have come back to you personally and members of your team. Can you talk about the personal risks of investigative journalism? Investigative journalism, we have to hold power to account. You know, it's all about holding power to account. And that can mean being a watchdog and looking into some of the things that governments and politicians and figures are doing. And they don't like that necessarily. So give us some personal experience. Try, if you can personalize it, if you don't mind, for you and your team. About the personal dangers of investigative journalism.
Sure. Thank you for asking. And also, I guess, let me tell you what my last week has been like, right? And it is it was triggered by an investigative report, a series of exclusives, 10 parts. It took us more than 3 months to do this. Our reporter, Patricia Evangelista, our photographer, Carlo Gabuco, went into ground zero, Del Pan, which is where the first killing in the drug war began last July. And in that series of 3 months, they were able to get the official police reports, which we put online, along with eyewitness accounts. And you can see them juxtaposed against each other. What makes this different is that the families named the killer cops. They named them. And the report, which we released a week ago, is now being used as a basis for legislators to call an investigation, to reopen an investigation. But the immediate reaction, so here's the report. If you can just show the link, the first link, the report showed a colonel, this cop in Tondo. He's called the Demon of Del Pan. His last name is Alvarez, and now they're going to open an investigation. So we can't see the link, you know? So the second link after that that I would have wanted to show you is another investigative series that Rappler did on the digital space. It's called The Weaponization of the Internet. And there we used data from the internet, data from Facebook, data from the kinds of comments and attacks done showing exactly how a small group of accounts, and the third part of the series shows how 26 fake accounts, and again this was a months-long investigation, 26 fake accounts, which we proved by shoe leather reporting were fake, could influence up to 3 million other accounts. And the 3 million other accounts included the campaign pages of both our president, he was then mayor when he was running for office, President Duterte, and the campaign pages of vice presidential candidate, he lost by 200,000 votes, Bongbong Marcos. He's the son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos. That one shows you how a small group can grow and influence, turn propaganda into reality for a substantial chunk of our audience in the Philippines. The last part I would have wanted to show you are the kinds of threats. So the investigative series came out last week. Within 2 days, myself and our reporter who is following President Duterte, were viciously attacked on social media. Oh, this isn't a long time ago. You can go down and click on this, no, sorry, go up, click on the photo of Peter Ian Tabar. Up on top to the Peter Ian Tabar, the Tabar, right there. There, click. This is normal. This is actually tame. And he's a real person. Die, stupid bitch. If you don't like our president, leave our country. Whore. I have some really nice ones. over the weekend, because what happened was a fake news site, in reaction largely, I think, to the investigative piece, a fake news site then came out with fake news that went viral about rape. And then the statements I had over the last weekend included this. This is from a real person. Maybe Maria Ressa's dream is to become the ultimate porn star in a gangbang scene. She is so desperate to get laid. Damn. Should I even be talking about this? This is in a public space. It got so bad that citizens on the internet actually came in and began cataloging. One person took a look at all the soldiers and policemen who were attacking with sexist and misogynistic statements. One person came out with an open letter to the Armed Forces Chief of Staff, the head of the military in the Philippines, and a day later, General Año actually apologized and ordered an investigation into the worst of the misogynistic attacks. So there's hope. The institution is there, but welcome to my world.
So let me just ask you very quickly a follow-up question. When you get those comments, how does that make you feel? Does it make you question what you do? Does it ever make you feel that you want to compromise what you do, or does it make you feel more determined? How do you feel personally when you get such trolls and intimidation?
We've been living with this since last October. I think at the beginning I looked at it and before I had all the data, and this is where data becomes very important for us as journalists. Before I had all the data, I thought, are we doing the right thing? Are we careful enough? You ask yourself all the questions, right? And you engage. But then you realize that it's a combination of fake accounts who won't listen, and they actually get real people to believe it. So what we did, the defense we did, was to gather the data and quantify the data. So you can actually see that when one post is reposted 1,000 times in a minute, that's not real. And then also we began to dialogue much more actively with Facebook and with Google for help in these. I think yesterday's panel failed to point out one thing, which is that in the end, as journalists, we continue to be gatekeepers to our publications, to our communities. But the true gatekeepers in this world now for what truth is Facebook, particularly in the Philippines and Indonesia. Because if you think about it, in our countries here, the internet is synonymous with Facebook. Google determines what gets fed to you. So the tech companies have taken over a lot of the things that we used to have.
Okay, I don't want to cut you off, and we hope to come back to this point about technology companies because it's very important. Let me move on to Anas. So, Anas, the mask that you wear is a physical testament to the need for you to preserve your anonymity and not to be recognized. Can you tell us about the work that you do and why you wear the mask, why you feel it's necessary to wear your mask because of the work you do? Just to give some context, Anas, about a year ago, made a film called Justice, in which he uncovered high-level corruption among over 20 high court judges in Ghana. So it was a fantastic investigation going to the very upper echelons of society. So, Anas, why do you wear your mask? And what is it about your work that makes you feel you need to wear your mask?
Well, I wear my mask because of dangers that is associated with journalism and the fact that you want to be able to live, to be able to tell the next story. I have always said that no story is worth the life of anybody. If you really want to be able to tell the story, you have to devise strategies of telling it. The threats in journalism are real, and we've heard a lot from other speakers. I don't need to go through it. And I think that is not synonymous with the African continent, or better still, Ghana. It's everywhere. The earlier we realize that this game is going to be a game of always the cat chasing the mouse, the better. It's a very hot kitchen. Whether we like it or not, those realities will always stare us in the face. The key thing I looked at when I was doing the judges, we usually called Ghana in the eyes of God, and 34 judges were caught taking bribes, and 146 court officials were also caught collecting bribe in the story I did. It was investigated over a 2-year period. Reason why I thought it was a story worth pursuing was the fact that judges are almost gods in the guise of men, and they are the last hope of society. So I felt that indeed it was about time to go ask those real questions to these judges and to find out whether we are even getting a fair treatment. And for the larger picture, in my opinion, maybe we should all be asking ourselves on the African continent that how did we get into that war in Liberia, the war in Sierra Leone, the war in Rwanda? Maybe if that judge who sat on that case between that Hutu and the Tutsi was fair, maybe we wouldn't have ended up having the genocide in Rwanda. So judges play such a key role. But then again, this brings me to the question of this same threat. How do you carry or move on with your piece of work? I have always believed in these 3 fundamental things: naming, shaming, and jailing. So instead of just doing the story and also knowing the kind of atmosphere that I live in, I'd always aim at also going to the court of law to testify the evidence that I've got. Because look, we're doing so many good journalism in the world that is going into the water just because we don't synchronize our efforts with law enforcement. We don't synchronize our efforts with the judiciary. So what I do is that I'm also a trained lawyer. I go to court, I testify. Like this judge's scandal, a committee is set up. You go and testify before the committee. My hidden camera video is played. I'm subjected to cross-examination. It's a very painful exercise, but the results are great. They are incredible. And I have done it over the years. I think it's superb. It works. Look, there's no point in doing journalism that at the end of the day comes back to frighten you. Journalism must lead to the progress of society. Over the years, I've done the Chinese sex mafia, which has seen the traffickers going into jail for 45 years. The Temahabo story and the Coco story, they are in jail for 16 years. Nana Kwesi Agyeman, who raped girls as young as 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 years, is in jail for 15 years because I carried it to the next step. Yes, I know that we will always talk about journalistic independence. But look, what's the point of carrying on with your independence which doesn't benefit society? I'm not saying that you should practice this in Canada or in America. I'm a product of my society. I'm doing what benefits my society. And I have studied carefully that there is no point in just doing journalism that people will read newspapers in their bedrooms and smile. If we really want to push society forward, if we want to move the frontiers of our democracy forward, then there must be a convergence at a particular stage between journalism and law enforcement so that we can impact positively on society. Thank you.
So, Rana, let me come to you. Your organization works with a lot of media organizations in the Middle East. In terms of personal risk, the Middle East, as you've mentioned, a conflict zone, a lot of journalists being imprisoned. How do you convince young journalists or would-be investigative journalists to get involved in this profession?
I mean, definitely investigative journalists aren't doing their job because they want to be popular or they want to become politicians. You know, we do this job knowing that we're going to offend many people, but the majority are going to be touched in a good way by the outcomes of what we have been doing. That doesn't mean that sometimes you have to pay the price. And for example, we had 2 journalists inside Syria 2 years ago that were doing an investigation on the curriculum that was being promoted by ISIS. And they were working with a freelance photographer who went into one of the printing houses and took shot with a hidden camera, copies of what they were teaching. And he was, of course, arrested and debriefed. And after a week, ISIS slit his throat open. And as a result, we had to take the 2 journalists out of Syria, and they're now living in Europe and in Turkey to protect them. In another instance, one of our journalists in Yemen, had to flee because she was also threatened. We've had 5 Syrian journalists that also took the boat journeys to Europe and had to leave because they couldn't live in their societies anymore. So, nothing comes for free. If you believe in the cause, you have to do everything possible to serve the cause. But what I think is very important is documentation, because even if we go to court, and it's part of the duty to go to court, we have to be smart enough to defend what we're saying and to have data and facts that can basically shoot down the opposing arguments.
So Wahyu and Sheila were generally fairly positive about the future of investigative journalism. Do you think do you see there is a new generation of investigative journalists wanting to get into this profession in the Middle East, despite the risks? Rana?
I mean, as I told you, when we started, everyone was laughing investigative journalism in the Arab world, and they had every right to laugh. But if I look back, we've done 410 investigations over 10 years. 1,800 journalists have been trained, and we continue to invest in them. We're teaching them follow the money skills, digital protection. So, I think 10 years down the line, if anybody wants to chronicle the start of investigative reporting, Arij is going to get the credit for that, for introducing it in a systematic way. The other thing is, we have new investigative chapters emerging in the Arab countries. There are 2 in Iraq, 1 in Tunisia, 1 in Palestine, 3 among the Syrians in exile, and 1 in Morocco. And this is very important, it doesn't come overnight. If you look at the movement, it started in the United States in the 19,000s. And it took like 100 years, and it was supported by literature, and it was supported by writers, it was supported by laws, by regulations, by the Free Act, So it takes time. It's a slow evolution. But I think many of the journalists that have worked with us say that their life has changed, and they are never able to work in the same way they have been working as journalists. And in the end, quality journalism is what can stand in the face of fake information, which has today proliferated the world. And as my colleague said, Google and Facebook do have a big responsibility in taking down this ugly content, the witch hunting, the accusations that have been targeting everybody that has been doing good journalism.
Okay. So let's move on to another challenge, but that of access journalism. Many times you need to report in dangerous areas, and sometimes it's quite difficult to get into those areas, whether for your physical safety or often because you need various sorts of permissions, and those permissions don't come through. So I want to ask Sheila, in terms of access, are there times when sometimes you need to break the law in order for the greater good of the story? For example, if you need to go into a region where you can't get access, official permission to get into a region, is it sometimes justified to go in almost illegally? Or what are the ethics of this issue?
Okay, so from an ICIJ point of view, we collaborate with local news organizations. So like we are a consortium, meaning that, for example, in Indonesia, Tempo is one of our partners. What this means is that, you know, we often rely on local journalists' knowledge of the country to access documents, sources, etc. So, you know, everyone, we encourage them, obviously, not to break the law. Let's say, for example, for the Panama Papers investigation, you know, like there were some, sometimes televisions want to do undercover. We always ask, do you really need to go undercover? Is that an information that you wouldn't get otherwise? Is it so important that you really need to go undercover and do something illegal? I guess, you know, the question is whether you can get that information otherwise. For example, whether you can ask you know, someone in another country to do that for you, because I don't know, maybe access is easier in that other country, or you know, so it really depends on I wouldn't, let me phrase this. It's so because we rely on local journalists' knowledge, we try not to, you know, like do parachute journalism and go to one place and say, okay, we are, you know, the American journalists, we want the information, so give it to us. We can break any law. That's not what we do. And you know, I don't think. I think that at the end, that, you know, what you want with investigative journalism is, you know, like spur a debate, have an impact. And if you obtain information illegally, I wonder what the final result will be. Like, how would the result of your investigation be seen? Even if it's the best investigation in the world, you know, like if you have obtained the information illegally, maybe people will focus on that detail and not on the real aspects. So these are all considerations that.
Okay. Wahyu, it was great to hear the Vice President and the President yesterday talking about, you know, affirming media freedom and the government not interfering. There have been some questions raised about access to the region of Papua and West Papua. Sheila mentioned about not journalists from the outside parachuting in, that it's not a good model and it's good to use local journalists. How do you deal with the issue of, for example, Papua? And do you think there are restrictions and limitations? And could you just talk about that?
Yes, I think Papua, the province of Papua and West Papua is a very specific case where we have not seen the level of freedom of access as in any other areas in Indonesia. Although for Indonesian journalists it's easy to fly there and report on events and issues, but usually the presence of the security force, the police, the army on Papua is really visible, and usually we Tempo sent a reporter last year, at the end of last year, to do a report on the current state of transportation there, and each day there's 1 or 2 police officers follow her around, you know, make sure that she didn't meet people that she's not supposed to meet. But that's a challenge that I guess faced by all journalists that try to expose important and, you know, big issues for the public interest. I think we have to, at the moment, we try to live with that, and we try to advocate for a more open and transparent Papua. Yeah, also in I think AJI, the Alliance of Independent Journalists, are working to put pressure on the government to be more open on Papua. But I think for Indonesian journalists based in Jakarta, there is also a gap of understanding, because journalists based in Jakarta sometimes don't really understand what is really needed in Papua, what are the current state in Papua. So we really need an improvement of the capability of the Papuan journalists themselves. So Papuan media, Papuan journalists needs a lot of support. We have seen more and more media opening up in the last few years, but they desperately need support. And if we can have a more robust and independent and quality journalists in Papua, I think that's one way forward to have a more open public conversation on Papua issues.
Okay. We've got about another half hour, just under half an hour, and I do want to open it up to questions. So I'm going to ask another question now, but just be ready. If you do have a question, there are going to be mics passed around, I believe, and if you do have a question, just raise your hand and I'll pick you out. But I want to just stay on this point about the ethics of journalism and come to Anas. You rely on going undercover, and you rely, in a way, let's be frank, you sometimes have to use deceit and pretend to be somebody that you're not in order for the greater good of uncovering truth and exposing things. Where are the lines between the ethical lines? To what extent do you have to rely on dishonesty, deceit, subterfuge in order to get to the truth? And what are you comfortable with doing and what are you not comfortable with doing? Anas.
Well, I think the lines are pretty clear. The laws are properly laid down. To be honest, I come from a common law background. Ghana, we learned from the British, so the laws are pretty clear. Privacy and public interest is something that one ought to look at when you're going undercover. For me, once you pick up that issue should be in the public interest. How do we get our issues as journalists? We have whistleblowers in society. We pick signals from our own communities. So by the time that story gets to that table to qualify to be an undercover piece, it's always a last resort. What a conventional camera can get, you don't need to go undercover for. So it's not that we are trigger happy and we just pick up a story and then we go for to do undercover. Yes, I agree with the fact that it's subterfuge. You have to deceive in order to be able to get the information. But at the end of the day, is it in the public interest? I think public interest overrides every other issue. Privacy. I have done a lot of cases. I mean, I was undercover in a psychiatric hospital as a patient. I was undercover in the prisons as a prison inmate. And on all these occasions, I had people challenging, saying that, well, this is a public institution. You had no business getting in there. But at the end of the day, the only thing that keeps the journalist's head up is the fact that it is in the public interest. Also, we don't just swim in the waters for nothing. For example, I'm guided by the BBC Ofcom rules. That's what keeps me going. And before I pick up any story, I make sure that there is a prima facie evidence before I get into that story. What I mean by this is that the person who has been caught in that corrupt act should have been in the habit of doing it. It's not one time go fishing and then you just pop up someone and say the person is a criminal. Before you take any story to any level, first of all, the prima facie evidence should have been guarded. Then you are now given the go ahead to go undercover and film. So yes, I would agree that we go with the aim of deceiving initially. Yes, that's true. But the end always justifies the means. At the end of the day, it should be in the public interest, and the rules ought to be carefully looked at and obeyed. Thank you.
Marie, you want to add to that?
For me, the end never justifies the means, and it may be because we come from different parts of the world. I think in particular right now, your approaches, you've got to be above reproach. It's almost like the drug war. You must have rule of law. If you don't have rule of law, you don't have anything. If you as the journalist accountable to the public bends the rule of law, then you kind of drink from tainted water. this is what I believe. And, you know, this is having come from being in a war zone situation to where we are today. I still believe that you've got to be, as a journalist, way above reproach, from taxes to behavior to decorum on social media, despite whatever anyone does to you.
You see, we cannot make a change if we continue to live and behave in a way. Look, what she just said, yes, appears good to hear, but on the ground, it doesn't happen. No, there are certain things that you can never be able to tell, certain stories that you will never be able to tell unless you have gone undercover. And we all know, various parts of the world, that certain stories, no matter what you do, if you go conventionally, you are not going to be able to tell that story. I have one in particular where there's this doctor in a theater who was aborting pregnancies of girls and sleeping with them at the same time. And he had done this to over 50 women. Now, how else were you expecting me to get that story? So I went in there undercover, planted my cameras, and I filmed this. How can I do this conventionally? It is not possible. So yes, we can talk all the talk, but on the ground, where the issues boil, you can't say that you are not going to break the law. So I still believe that the end must justify the means. And if you are able to go above that public interest threshold, then you are perfectly within the law. You haven't broken any law.
Okay. If there are any questions, just raise your hand and we'll come to you. But I'm looking around for any hands while we're speaking, so just put your hand up if you have a question. But, okay, I'm going to come to you in a minute. One question, then I'll come to you, sir. Rana, another challenge of investigative journalism is actually what this report is about, protecting journalism sources. Obviously, whistleblowers are very important, and you need to protect them. Privacy is essential to protect journalists, and it enables society to benefit from investigative journalism. Can you tell us about the challenge, the increasing challenges today of how protecting our sources is so important, and the difficulties with the new surveillances, mass surveillance, targeted surveillance, and all the new laws, the new anti-terrorism laws, so-called anti-terrorism laws? How, in today's world, is it becoming, or is it becoming, more difficult to protect our sources?
I mean, laws in most Arab states are in favor of source protection. This is in the text, but in reality, things can be different. For example, whistleblowers in Jordan are protected under the anti-graft law, but they're not protected in the freedom to access information law. In other countries, it's different. So it's pretty much dependent on the countries where we operate. But in context, it's part of our training to tell our journalists that they have to be very careful when they are interviewing people that really have the secrets. We encourage them to meet them face to face. We encourage them to use very, old technology mobiles that they can just get rid of. We encourage them to not to give any names to the sources when they store the information in computers. It can be source A, B, or C. We also tell them to work in teams. We give them applications. If they are basically in danger, they can just pull the trigger, and sometimes somebody outside will be working with them. When it comes to using hidden cameras, we follow the BBC and Al Jazeera guidelines. And as Anas and Maria have been saying, the public interest is the weight that we use when we decide to use secret filming. That's the last resort we do, but very often it's the only way we can prove the evidence that we have collected. We have done that in an investigation in Jordan, where caregivers in private care centers looking after mentally challenged children were abusing them, chaining them to radiators, breaking their bones, insulting them physically and sexually. And the only way to do that was to spend 2 weeks at 3 centers and then to go back after 6 months to make sure that this was not happening just by accident. We had to do the same thing in Tunisia when our journalists, when Tunisia was under the rule of Ennahda party, the pro, was turning a blind eye to nurseries that were teaching very strict Wahhabi literature. And this journalist had to go in and pretend she was being trained on how to teach at these schools, and she basically had to take and film whatever was being told to these journalists, to these little young kids under the age of 6. So there was no way for us to document that.
Okay. Let's have the question from the gentleman who put his hand up first. I don't know if you have a microphone. Do you have a microphone? Do we have microphones? Okay, while we're getting the microphone, do we have microphones? Okay, so that's the gentleman standing up over there?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So, gentleman standing up over there, if you could just give your...
Tolong mikrofonnya diarahkan kepada Bapak yang berdiri di sebelah kiri.
Just give your name and either who you work for, what you're doing, whether you're a student or what. And
Okay.
please make your questions short and sharp and concise and not long
Hello,
statements, please.
My name is Renardo Sinaga. I'm from West Kalimantan province. I'm a junior desk editor from Radio Republic of Indonesia. I want to ask to Maria from Philippines. Recently, the head of the Indonesian Narcotic Agency, even the president of Indonesia, Joko Widodo, met the president of Duterte to discuss the any problem and especially of drugs in both countries. One day after coming home to Indonesia from the Philippines, in my area in West Kalimantan, one of the province in Indonesia which bordered with Malaysia, in my record have 4 people suspected drug dealer shot dead. And when we in West Kalimantan want to investigate it or just get more information, it seemed to be silenced from the National Narcotic Agency or the police. Which I want to ask to you, whether in Philippines is also the same in my country and my region. As a note, the drug that go to West Kalimantan and captured by 100 kilos from Malaysia. I want to ask to you, I repeat again.
Okay,
I want to ask to you whether in Philippines is also the same in
All right.
Indonesia.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Maria, did you get that? It's a bit difficult to hear
So
up here.
we can hear you when we're here, but not from back here.
Okay.
Maaf ya Pak, I didn't hear the first part of your question about the drug dealers in Malaysia.
Is that one?
I want to ask to you, in Indonesia, for to expose the information from National Agency for Narcotics are difficult. Same in Indonesia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
If it is difficult to expose...
Sorry, Maria,
To expose it.
before you answer, could you just repeat the question very briefly? Before you answer, Maria, before you answer the question, could you just repeat it? Maria. Sorry, we're having a real problem with sound up here.
Sorry.
It might sound
Giles,
okay
it's
from where
hard
you
to
are.
hear you too. You know, it's easier
Maria.
to listen. Yes.
Could you, before answering the question, could you just repeat it briefly?
Okay. So here's what I thought I heard, that there is a hard time in Indonesia of reporting data coming from the government the same way as Malaysia. And do we have the same problem in the Philippines? Okay, so definitely drugs. It's a key problem in all of our countries, and we're talking about, in the Philippines, shabu, methamphetamine. Our problem in reporting it is not actually in talking to the people, it's in getting real numbers. So I'll give you an example. The Dangerous Drugs Board, which is a government agency, says that there's 1.8 million drug users in the Philippines. But our president says there are 4 million. Who's correct? And drilling it down becomes even more difficult. We have a Freedom of Information Act. The president signed an executive order, and yet getting the real information is still difficult. There is no doubt drugs are a problem, and it is a problem in the poorest of the poor, the areas where people are getting summarily executed. I think where we differ is in the solution. So the last part I would say is the context of that for the Philippines. Why was President Duterte elected on this? Before the campaigns, it was a number 8 issue. After the campaigns, it became number 1. Part of it is because of the weakness of our justice system. It is so weak that there is no justice. And so what President Duterte has done is he said, I will provide a solution. And perhaps fear is one way to fight the drug war, but it doesn't work. I don't know if I answered your question directly, but it's not getting data from government or information from government that's a problem. It's trying to determine the veracity of everything that is coming at us now after the change of administration, and then verifying it with people who live it on the ground. Because that extra layer of social media now actually is acting as a way to isolate and create echo chambers where each group's truths are amplified for that particular truth, for that particular group, but we can't come up with our own way of determining this is reality. So for example, if the people on the right decide that the sky is yellow, the people in the middle decide the sky is orange, you decide the sky is blue, and the people on my left decide that the sky is red. If you're all screaming at each other, our old role as journalists determining analysis and truth becomes lost in the noise.
Okay, thank you. If there's another question, what I'm going to ask is if you wouldn't mind coming forward to near the stage with the mic, then we might be able to hear you. It might prevent more people asking questions, but the gentleman with his hand up there, if you don't mind coming forward, we can there's a sound echo, and it's just very difficult to hear from here up on stage. So if you come to the stage, use the mic, just come here, and we might be able to hear you.
Hello. Are you able to hear me? Still no?
No, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning. I'm Gerald Joseph, a commissioner with the National Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. First of all, congratulations for your courage, because without you, we cannot do the human rights work. So that's really remarkable. My question is, most of our countries don't have Right to Information Act. How do you, the network of journalists, still help to put out the information without a Right to Information Act? That's one question.
Okay.
And number two...
Did everybody get that?
Yeah.
So the question is a Right for Information Act.
The Right to Information
Yes.
A Right to Information Act.
Right to Information Act. Many countries don't have a Right to Information Act. How do you operate without such an act? Okay.
And the second, is there a proposal by journalists across the world? How do we get the information out when you cannot do it in country? Because I see the journalist from Ghana is really taking pains to protect his identity. Is that the proposal, or are there other mechanisms that the information can go out to another part of the world and then it comes back to in country?
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Anas, did you get that? Do you want to address that second point first? All right, before we go to Anas, let's go address the first question, the right to information. Wahyu, do you have any, how is Indonesia on the Right to Information Act? Is there such an act? And if not, how can investigative journalism How does it operate without?
Yes, Indonesia has a Freedom of Information Act since 2008. It's a half measure, I have to admit, because even though if we have dispute with the government about a certain information, it has to be decided by a commission of information, but the result, the verdict of that commission is not final. So the government used to appeal to the court to any decision that might, disadvantage the government in any way. So the structure is not perfect, but at least the law acknowledges that citizen has a right to information. But having said that, I think the gentleman was right. I mean, without an open data policy, without the government opening up and put out their public data that is collected by tax money and relevance to the public interest, I think it's very difficult for journalists to operate. We have been relying on leaks, whistleblowers from inside the government, but it's getting more and more difficult because of the monitoring and the more stringent ways of the government to make sure that there's no leak from within. So I guess the second part that we have to have in place is a secure leak platform. And I think in many countries that has been proven quite effective. I think in Netherlands we have pub leaks. In Mexico we have Mexico leaks, and we try to implement the same tools in Indonesia.
All right. Anas, do you want to address the second part of that gentleman's question?
I think that it's one thing having right to information, and countries go along, people write, we get to stages where we have the bill. But even though you have the bill, the implementation becomes an issue. So for me, as journalists, though many of our African countries do not have the right to information bill passed, we ought to still find a way of getting that information out. And today with the digital world, we have many platforms to do this. We are also hooked up with many international organizations. When I say international organizations, I mean the international media. That helps us to put our things out. So the mere fact of having laws that have been, assented to, that your president has assented to, is not enough to think that, yes, I have freedom of information, so it means that we ought to just go ahead and talk. Yes, your information is there, but there are certain things that government people do that, in spite of the fact that you have laws, you are not going to be able to get access to that information. So looking at just the law alone is not enough. As journalists, we have to be ingenious. We have to look for many other ways of bringing out such information. And I would always say that no government will look at a piece of information that hurts him and put it out for that journalist. No, they will never do it. So whether there is freedom of information bill, there is an act or not, as journalists, we must devise many means of telling their stories. They will always come after us. They will always want us not to tell their story, whether you have a bill or not. It's up to us to ensure that we have proper connections within the outside world to be able to tell their stories to the benefit of the people who have enshrined or given us that right to tell their stories for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and Maria wants to say something, but before you say something, we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask a few more questions here. The lady in the white jacket, before we come to you, I want to just, there was some other issues we wanted to discuss, so I'm going to wrap them all up, because we've talked about the challenges, but I wanted also to talk about the opportunities. So very quickly, Sheila, in terms, we've talked about technology and the technology companies being the gatekeepers of information which is, can be a very worrying thing. But we have to recognize that technology has also been a great help in, okay, this is what you wanted to mention, in investigative journalism. So Sheila, in what ways are the new tools and the new technologies helping investigative journalism today?
Okay, so at the SAJ, you know, a big part of our team is they are like programmers and engineers, meaning that they also have a journalism background. But what it means is that, you know, because we have these projects that are international, they usually involve dozens of people around the world. We rely on technology for that and secure platforms. You know, we use open software, open source softwares, and our engineers and programmers are able to customize those for our purposes. That's what we did for the Panama Papers and other leaks before. We, as well as other news organizations in the US and I think in other countries as well, use, for example, secure drop to get, you know, for people who want to send us information in a secure way. We use encryption to talk, to communicate with our colleagues as well as sources, because I just wanted to stress that obviously we want to protect our sources, but we also want to protect our colleagues who may work in difficult countries. So just to go back to one of the points that we were discussing before about, you know, how do you, collaboration can actually, cross-border collaboration can also be a very valid tool to help people who do not have, who have problems with their government or pressure from their, you know, business from companies, etc. If, you know, collaboration in that regard help them, you know, cover stories maybe without a byline, but you know, still make them allow them to, you know, to report on things that can be difficult to be reported on in one single country, but because they are reported on by many other people and for the same project, you know, they could be, you know, they can be protected in a way. So, you know, for technology for us is important, not just because as a like a development tool, as a like a means to actually produce investigation, but it's also important to have more secure investigations and protect our sources as well as our colleagues.
Okay, thank you. So the question in the front, we're going to put on our speakers, and I'm told that we're going to hear better if we put on our headphones. So go ahead.
Hi, my name is Adama Liba. I'm from the Gambia, West Africa. My question goes to Mr. Anas. Do you have any projects or programs where you seek to inspire young journalists in West Africa to continue the line of duty? Because you and I know how journalism is actually taken in Africa in general. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Anas, I think from what I got about inspiring young journalists in Africa.
Well, I think that trainings have been ongoing, and one of the big programs we have, the Africa Investigates, which we do with Al Jazeera, is not just about doing the story as it should be, but we go into the various African countries and we pick reporters. We all undergo training, and at the end of the day, we tell the story. So it's not just about us just speaking or us just telling, or people just telling you to do that story. But it's also the aim is for you, the journalist, to be able to identify that story that affects your society in a negative way. So we've gone past those ages where the Western media will have to say, okay, I want to do a story on cocoa, I want to do a story on gold. Our Africa Investigates series gives us that opportunity to be local journalists, selecting the stories that we want to tell our people, stories that benefit or inure to the benefit of our society. So we meet together as a team, we go through this training, and then we go back to our various countries and we tell the stories in various series. That in exception, We've been organizing workshops for our colleagues. We have the Forum for African Investigative Reporters, where we meet as African reporters to teach each other the skills we have gotten over the years. Also, transnational investigations have helped because it means that your colleague in America, who you are doing that story with, would impact his knowledge onto you so that you'll be able to also learn a bit. So it's always been a world of sharing knowledge and learning from each. I never stopped learning. Since I came here, I've met some of my colleagues. We put notes together. We always learn to ensure that we tell the same story. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And yes, your last point, the collaboration, I mean, we wanted to raise it, but the collaboration and how the technology is allowing collaboration across the world. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We've already gone over time. I just want to thank our panel of guests. Some have come not too far away, but others have come, I think, very far away and flown for many, many hours to get here. So thank you very much to our panel of guests, and thank you to the audience for your questions. Thank you very much.
To the moderator and also to all the panelists, please remain on stage. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? May I kindly invite Mr. Ahmad Jauhar, the Vice Chairman of the Indonesian Press Council, to present a memento, or a token of appreciation. And I would also like to kindly invite on stage back Mr. Oscar Cantu to also receive the memento. Mr. Oscar Cantu, please kindly come up on stage. I think we need to give a round of applause to our panelists and moderator because they have really conducted a very great job and also had been a very good listener. And we're going to also make a group photo as well. This is a picture of each and everyone who were conducting the plenary session and also giving the keynote speech. And we are also providing the commemorative first stamp envelope of World Press Freedom Day 2017. So we hope that the pictures are also very nice. If not, then you can ask the organizers to take another picture. Is that okay with you? Best Picture Award. Aside from the pictures that are given, again, the commemorative first stamp envelope, coming in the color and design of black and white, the coverage of the signing of the Linggar Jati Treaty, 15th of November 1946 in Jakarta, and also the press coverage of today, using the most advanced technology. And we're going to make a group photo first. Can we invite the Assistant Director General of UNESCO to take a picture together as well? Please, one more picture taking, please. Meanwhile, the pictures are taken. We would like to invite the remaining guests for coffee, tea, and refreshment. We have parallel sessions which starts at 11:15, and then there will be another parallel sessions after that. There will be a lunch break, and then we will come back to this room again at 3:45 for the closing ceremony. Okay, we will make another group photo. Refreshment is available at the assembly room 3 and also at the lower lobby. So we have two places, Assembly, Hall 3, and the lower lobby. Thank you very much. The parallel session starts at 11:15. Venue, Merak Room 1. How fake news and social media filter bubbles are on impacting the role of journalism in a society. And then there is parallel session 8 in Merak Room 2. Conflict sensitive reporting unpacked. And also in Merak Room 2, Session 9, the organizer World Press Photo Foundation.